I'm Robert Fairhead from Tall and True Short Reads and the Tall and True Writers website. In October 2024, I released episode 100 of Tall and True Short Reads, Twin Souls in the Universe, marking the end of Season 4 of my storytelling podcast, which I launched in September 2020. Since then, I've taken a break from podcasting to focus on writing projects, including publishing my latest short story collection, One Day in the Life of Alex's AI, and other speculative fiction. Please see the show notes for links to this and my earlier short story and microfiction collections. I've also been planning a new direction for Season 5 of the podcast, which I hope to launch early next year. Watch your feed for details. Meanwhile, I've gift-wrapped the first episodes from Seasons 1 to 4 of Tall and True Short Reads for this year's bumper Kris Kringle episode. Season 1, 5 Meet on Zoom. Episode 1 of the podcast, released 10th of October, 2020. Season 2, The Last Book That Made You Cry. Episode 33, released 13th of September, 2021. Season 3, Once Upon a Time. Episode 59, released 16th of September, 2022. And Season 4, Some Things Change. Perth, Western Australia, 1979. Episode 79, released 26th of September, 2023. After each Kringle episode, I explain when and why I wrote the story or post. 5 Meet on Zoom, a short story by Robert Fairhead. 5 logged on to their first Zoom meeting. "Righto, can everyone hear and see me?" asked Julian, who, as the leader, had scheduled the meeting and emailed the invites, with help from his clever clog's cousin George. "Yes," his brother Dick beamed back. "Splendid stuff. Well done, Julian." George responded with a curt nod of her short-cropped head. "Do you like my background, Julian?" she asked, thumbing over her shoulder at a green-screen panorama of Kirin Island. Julian was about to respond indifferently when another voice cut him off. "Woof! Well, Timmy likes it," chipped in his sister Anne, though no one could see her. "Anne, you silly girl, something's wrong. We can't see you," said Julian in an exasperated tone. "Tap the video icon on your phone," George explained more kindly. "Oh, sorry," apologised Anne, as she suddenly appeared all rosy-cheeked. "I was laughing so much at Timmy, I forgot." "Woof," said Timmy, and everyone laughed, except for Julian. George had set up an iPad beside her, so Timmy could join the 4 cousins on Zoom. "Well, enough larking about," said Julian sternly. "It's time to start planning our camping holiday." George scowled fiercely down her webcam. "Julian, we've talked about this. We can't go camping during the lockdown." "George is right," agreed Anne with a frown. "We don't want to get sick or break the law." "Oh, you girls, you're always sticking up for each other," said Dick, defending his big brother. Julian seemed rather cross and was talking, but no one could hear him. Dick and Anne looked confused. Timmy woofed, and George shook her head. "We've lost your audio, Julian," she told him. "Check if you've clicked mute." Everyone watched as Julian glared down at the icons on his screen. He disappeared from view, reappeared, and then they heard him swearing, quite rudely. "Julian!" exclaimed Anne, blushing. Dick smirked, Timmy woofed, "Woof!" and George scowled again. "I meant to say blast it," said Julian, feeling hot and bothered. As the oldest, Julian had always been the best at everything. He could mend punctures, put up a tent, and row a boat better than his younger siblings and cousin. He even beat George swimming off Kirin Island last summer holidays, and she was a jolly strong swimmer, for a girl. But dash it all, everything was topsy-turvy at the moment, what with coronavirus and lockdowns and not going camping and not seeing grandparents. Julian felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Blast it. Is your audio muted again?" George asked. Julian realised everyone, including Timmy, was looking at him, waiting for an answer. He was their leader. What should he say? Julian blinked and cleared his throat. "I think we should meet again next week. George, you're better at this Zoom thing than me. Please take my place and email the invites." The screens went blank. George smiled and reached down to pat Timmy. "Perhaps there is a silver lining to this wretched virus," she said, and Timmy woofed. "Woof, woof." I wrote 5 Meet on Zoom for Furious Fiction, a monthly short story writing competition run by the Australian Writers' Centre in May 2020. Held on the first weekend of the month, writers had 55 hours to write a 500-word story based on a brief set by the Writers' Centre. For Furious Fiction May, the first word of the story had to be 5, and it had to include something being replaced and the phrase "a silver lining." My boyhood love of Enid Blyton's famous 5 books inspired 5 Meet on Zoom, and our socially isolated times where it seems everyone is meeting via Zoom, even the family dog. Julian, struggling with technology and lockdown, hands his leadership role to his clever clog's cousin, George. And on replacing Julian as the leader of future Zoom meetings, George comments to Timmy the dog, "Perhaps there is a silver lining to this wretched virus. Woof! I didn't win nor make the short or long list for the May competition, but I had fun with 5 Meet on Zoom. Perhaps, as George observed, there is a silver lining to the coronavirus lockdown. More time to write." The Last Book That Made You Cry, a blog post written and narrated by Robert Fairhead. Penguin Books Australia posted a question on Facebook in August 2017. What is the last book that made you cry? The books could evoke tears of joy or sadness, and I immediately thought of 3 books, all for the latter category. And here are my top 3 tearjerkers. 1. Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. I read Tuesdays with Morrie while being Mr. Mom for my then toddler son. I had a home-based software consultancy, and the plan was to catch up on project work during my son's morning and afternoon sleeps. However, his morning sleep rarely happened, and he wouldn't settle for his afternoon sleep unless I pushed him around the block in his pram. And then I couldn't get the pram back in the front gate without waking him. In the end, I gave up trying to squeeze in work in the afternoons. Instead, I pushed my sleeping son to a local park and enjoyed an hour or so of reading. And it was during this period I discovered Tuesdays with Morrie. This blog post is not the place for an in-depth review of the book. Safe to say, the writer, Mitch Albom, learns his old college professor, Morrie, is dying from ALS and spends Tuesdays visiting and philosophising with him until the inevitable conclusion. I wanted to avoid the conclusion for as long as possible. So when I got to the final chapters, I put the book aside. After that, I read several books on my afternoon walks in the park, with my son asleep in his pram, until one day I braved Tuesdays with Morrie again, tackling the final chapters. I had been right to hold off reading about Morrie's passing, but it felt good to do so finally, and to shed tears, and afterwards I felt ready to push my son home and move on. 2. Marley and Me by John Grogan. I've had Labradors. I know the joy of owning a dog turns into sadness at the end of its life. So why would I want to read Marley and Me? I knew how it would end. And yet every dog owner and lover I met would ask, "Have you read Marley and Me? It's about a Labrador. You'd love it." So I risked the book. And I didn't love it, because the writer, John Grogan, and his family annoyed me with how they let Marley run and, at times, ruin their lives. I'm a part-time dog training instructor, and I could see the dog needed boundaries and a fence. But I stuck to reading it, shaking my head and tut-tutting until the last few chapters. You see, I had an old Labrador when I was reading Marley and Me, and Marley's ageing in the book triggered emotions I wasn't ready to deal with, not with my old dog. So like Tuesdays with Morrie, I put the book aside until I felt I was ready to read the final chapters of Marley's life. Only I was wrong this time. I wasn't ready to read about Marley's death, nor was I ready when my old Labrador passed away. There are some things dog owners are never ready to deal with, and this thing proved to be one of them. 3. The Book Thief by Marcus Suzak. I've read many books about World War II, non-fiction and fiction, seen countless films and documentaries, visited war sites and concentration camps. But The Book Thief by Marcus Suzak was the first time I'd read about the life of a normal German family during the war. And it confirmed what I knew to be true in my heart and head, that not all Germans were Nazis. The book's setting in wartime Germany, with death as the narrator, didn't augur well for the main characters, all of whom I grew to know and care for, thanks to Suzak's skillful writing. So as the Allied bombing raids pushed further and further into Germany, my fear for my fictional friends grew. I didn't put the book away this time, but read it to the end and let the tears flow. Of the 3 books that have moved me to tears in recent times, The Book Thief stands alone in being a work of fiction, and it's a prime example for aspiring writers of what they should strive to do with their writing, to engage and move the readers to tears of joy or sadness. As I explained in the Season 2 trailer for this podcast, in addition to short stories, I'm expanding Tall and True short reads to feature my blog posts and other writing from the Tall and True website. Fittingly for this first episode of Season 2, The Last Book That Made You Cry was the first blog post I shared on Tall and True in August 2017. And it was inspired by a question posted by Penguin Books Australia on Facebook. What is the last book that made you cry? Tuesdays with Maury, Marley and Me, and The Book Thief sprung to mind. Recollections of being Mr. Mom with my toddler son and of a dear departed dog amplified the tugging of heartstrings over the first two non-fiction tearjerkers. And an interest in World War II history and skillful writing by Marcus Cusack had me emotionally invested and weeping reading The Book Thief. I've read many books since 2017, and the most recent that made me cry is another work of fiction, The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams. I shed tears towards the end and closed the book wanting to know more about the characters. How had their lives played out? And subsequently, I posed this question to Pip Williams in a readers' event as part of ABC Radio National's Big Weekend of Books for 2021. As I observed in the Last Book That Made You Cry blog post, writers should strive to engage and move their readers to tears of joy or sadness. Tuesdays with Maury, Marley and Me, and The Book Thief did this for me, and so did the Dictionary of Lost Words. And in a further example of a good goal for writers, Pip Williams had me concerned about her characters beyond the book. Once Upon a Time, a short story written and narrated by Robert Fairhead. This story begins at the end, but my time spent observing your planet has taught me humans like to process events and information in an orderly, if not entirely predictable sequence. So forget the first sentence, and I'll serve you a linear tale. Just don't skip to the end and spoil it. Part 1. An early UN climate change conference in the 1990s. Our protagonists enter the main conference area stage left and right. A pair of dedicated young scientists, heads down, poring and worrying over data and projections. They collide and papers fly everywhere. "For goodness sake, watch where you're going," she explodes and kneels to collect her papers from the floor. "You too," he retorts, also kneeling. Clutching their mixed-up piles, they apologise awkwardly, introduce themselves, and find a table to separate and sort the papers. Remember, humans like orderly information. It's an unpromising start to a relationship which, despite conference gossip, will remain professional and never romantic. But it's also the beginning of a long-term collaboration between two scientists keenly concerned about the effects of climate change. How do I know this? Because, unlike you, I'm not limited to linear timelines. Part 2. A post-pandemic UN climate change conference in the 2020s. And our more mature protagonists are catching up at a social event after the first day's plenary session. "How are the children?" she asks, clinking his glass. "Both at university," he replies, adding, "The years have flown by, so fast. Too fast," she comments. "With too little action," he reflects. They sip their drinks in contemplative silence for a few moments before dissecting the day's speeches. The projections and promises, the depressing reports of illegal logging and deforestation, and the lack of progress on reducing carbon emissions, and the emergence of a block of climate change adaptists, seemingly intent on hijacking the conference agenda. "Are we too late?" she asks. "No, it's never too late," he asserts, clinking her glass. "For hope and action." Our protagonists have matured, but retain the optimism of young scientists. Optimism is another endearing trait I've noticed in humans. Part 3. A UN Climate Adaptation Conference in the late 2050s. Our protagonists are much older, and although both are retired, they have accepted an invitation to address a forum on the conference sidelines. "It's down to the wire," she says in closing, still sounding strong and determined. "But with goodwill and purpose," he adds, pausing to grip the lectern to steady the tremor in his hands and voice, "we can reverse the effects of climate change." The applause is generous, but it's not the main conference hall, and our protagonists give each other a resigned look, acknowledging those days and hopes are in the past. Once upon a time, a pair of dedicated young scientists tried to save the world from climate change. But you know that, even with your linear limitations. And how does our story end? That's up to you. I'm only here to observe your planet. I wrote Once Upon a Time in June 2022 for the Australian Writer Centre's quarterly writing competition, Furious Fiction. The brief for the 500-word short story was, it had to begin with a sentence containing exactly 6 words, include something being served, and use the words stage, wire and log. Longer variations were acceptable as long as they retained the original spelling. Fittingly, the 6-word sentence popped into my head first. This story begins at the end. And it also signposted the ending, so I knew my writing destination. I wanted to play with form and point of view in the story, so I came up with the idea of an omniscient narrator, possibly otherworldly, and not limited to linear timelines. However, our narrator has observed that humans like to process events and information in an orderly sequence, and so serves the reader a 3-part linear tale of 2 scientists dedicated to saving the world from climate change. We follow the scientists from their first meeting at a UN climate change conference in the 1990s to their collaboration catch-up at a post-pandemic UN conference in the 2020s and joint address on the sidelines of a UN climate adaptation conference in the late 2050s. In addition to form and point of view, I wanted to write a story on climate change, about how scientists have warned us of its existence for decades, while vested interests have denied it or urged us to adapt rather than take action to halt and reverse its effects. I found places for the required words from the brief and the story, although I took advantage of being allowed to use longer variations for one of them. Did you hear the words? And for the sentence callback at the end of the story, I used a classic beginning. Once upon a time, a pair of dedicated young scientists tried to save the world from climate change. But as our narrator-observer explains, how this story ends is up to the reader. Some Things Change. Perth, Western Australia, 1979. A short story written and narrated by Robert Fairhead. It's a hot summer afternoon with no sign of the Freo doctor. Despite the heat, I'm climbing the tree in Gran's backyard with my brothers and boy cousins, while our girl cousins chat in a circle in the shade of the back veranda. Like the other boys, I'm in shorts, with no shirt or shoes. Our tomboy cousin's up here too, and though she's wearing a dress, she's also barefoot. Mum and my aunts sit with Gran at the picnic table on the veranda. The women are shooing flies from salad bowls, refilling their wine glasses from a cask on the table, and laughing over shared gossip. Dad and the uncles are on barbecue duty, prodding and turning sizzling steaks and sausages, drinking cold beers from an esky, and discussing the latest news, including this morning's headline about an Aboriginal protest. You've got to understand that Aborigines are different from us, Dad says, responding to an uncle's comment, criticising the protest. And we need to respect this. But I do, my uncle insists. I respect all the Abos who play footy for East Perth. The backyard erupts into blokey laughter, drowning out the women and girls on the veranda, and us kids in the tree. East Perth's my favourite footy team, and I have autographs from several Aboriginal players. Dad doesn't like me calling them Abos, so I swing down to a lower branch to get closer to the conversation. There's a rustle of leaves, and I glance back to see my tomboy cousin crouched on the branch behind me. We exchange nods, and I return my attention to the barbecue. That's not what I meant, and you know it, Dad tells my uncle over the laughter. I saw a TV documentary that explained how Aborigines have a deep connection with the land, and it's why they go walkabout, to spend time on it. Well, my uncle responds, winking at the other uncles, they'd better not go walkabout when playing for East Perth, or they'll lose my respect. There's more blokey laughter. Dad shakes his head, and another uncle opens the esky and hands around more beers. And with a loud chorus of cheers, the barbecue discussion shifts to another headline. I'm about to start climbing again when my cousin asks, do you think it's true? What? I reply, turning to face her on the branch. She's a year or 2 younger than me, with freckles and long fair hair, and she looks familiar, but I can't remember her name. I've got lots of cousins, and I've got a bad memory for names. But Mum says that's not my fault. It's how my brain works. Do you think Aborigines go walkabout to spend time on the land? I don't know, I answer with a shrug. We don't know any Aborigines. There aren't any at my school, and the only ones I ever see are on TV. or hanging about in parks or outside shops, or playing footy for East Perth. My cousin nods and adds, "We had an Aboriginal girl in my class at school, but she's gone now." "Where?" I ask. "I don't know," my cousin mimics my shrugged response. "She and her little brother used to sit together in the playground at recess and lunch, but they never had lunch boxes. And then one day, she wasn't at school, and I haven't seen her or her brother since." "Perhaps they went walkabout," I suggest. My cousin nods again. "Perhaps," she echoes, standing up and grabbing a higher branch. "Race you to the top." I consider chasing her, but although she's younger than me, my cousin's a good climber, so I let her go, and instead I sit on the branch and stare over Gran's roof at the horizon, reflecting on what Dad said about Aborigines and their connection with the land. If East Perth's Aborigines went walkabout, would they come back and play footy for the team on the weekend? And what about the Aboriginal girl and her brother at my cousin's school? Have they gone walkabout? And if so, could they reappear in the playground one day? Below me, Dad and the uncles are carrying the esky and cooked steaks and sausages to the picnic table, and Mum is calling for us kids to climb down from the tree. So these are questions for another time. Some Things Change was my submission for the Big Issue Fiction Edition 2023. The Big Issues brief was broad, stories of all kinds, literary, comedy, romance, sci-fi, crime, and everything in between, from 500 to 3,000 words. I regularly submit 500-word short stories to the Australian Writers' Centre's Furious Fiction Writing Challenges, and the temptation was to write a shorter-length story similar to my Furious Fictions. But I wanted to stretch myself and my writing, so I wrote a longer short story, just over 2,700 words, consisting of 3 vignettes, set in different locations and times, but with a common thread. 2 protagonists, a pair of cousins, exploring Australia's history and relationship with Indigenous peoples. Perth, Western Australia, 1979 is the first vignette. There are elements of autofiction in this story. I grew up in Perth in the 1960s and 70s and supported the East Perth footy team. The Freo Doctor is the late afternoon sea breeze that cools the city and suburbs on hot summer days. And I was exposed to casual and overt racism towards Indigenous Australians as a boy, when Aboriginal people were called Abos and worse. I also have a cousin named Jenny who has fair red hair and freckles. And after sharing this story, she reminded me that we climbed trees together when we were younger. But, please forgive me for revealing this, Jen, she's 1 year older than me. And we never overheard the conversation between the dads and uncles at the family barbecue. So while this story draws on my life, it's mostly my imagination. Except, sadly, for the parts about the discrimination and lack of understanding endured by Indigenous Australians. I hope you enjoyed this year's Kris Kringle collection. You can read my selected short stories, blog posts and other writings on tallandtrue.com. You can also buy my short story collections, including One Day in the Life of Alex's AI and other speculative fiction, from the Amazon Kindle, Apple Books and Kobo online bookstores. There are links in the show notes. Season 5 of Tall and True Short Reads will appear in your podcast feed in the new year. In the meantime, browse your feed or the podcast website, tallandtrueshortreads.com, for earlier episodes from all 4 seasons. And please follow or subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it via your favourite app. Doing so helps me share my storytelling. You can support the podcast financially by making a small one-off or regular donation through the Acast supporter page. The link is in the show notes. Finally, I wish you a happy and safe festive and holiday season. Please share this Kris Kringle gift with family and friends, and spread the good tidings about Tall and True Short Reads and the Tall and True Writers website.